The moment Elias Norwood saw the woman step off that train, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. She wasn't quiet, she wasn't meek, and she damn sure wasn't going to scrub his floors without a fight. Helena Weiss stood on that platform with a violin case in one hand and fire in her eyes, looking at him like he was something she'd scraped off her boot. The mail-order bride he'd ordered like a piece of farm equipment had just become his worst nightmare. This is the story of how a silent rancher and a stubborn immigrant turned the Montana frontier upside down. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train whistle cut through the morning like a knife. Elias stood on the platform in Bozeman, Montana territory, his hat pulled low, his jaw tight. November 1883, and the air already tasted like snow. Around him, the usual chaos, freight handlers shouting, women clutching shawls against the wind, children darting between luggage carts. He didn't look at any of them. He was waiting for one person, a wife. The thought still felt wrong in his mouth. For 34 years, Elias Norwood had survived just fine alone. He'd carved a ranch out of Yellowstone Valley with his bare hands, built a cabin that could withstand the worst winters the territory could throw at it, and run cattle across land that had killed softer men. He didn't need companionship. He needed someone to cook, clean, and not ask questions. That's what he'd written in the letter. Seeking practical woman for frontier marriage. Must tolerate isolation, harsh winters, and limited conversation. No romantic expectations. Compensation. Shelter, food, security. Romantic. The word had felt stupid even as he'd written it. Elias didn't do romance. He did survival. 3 women had responded. He'd picked Helena Weiss because her letter was the shortest. I accept your terms. I arrive November 3rd. No questions, no demands. Perfect. The train hissed to a stop. Elias watched passengers pour onto the platform. A family of 5. 2 businessmen in city suits. An old woman with a cage full of chickens. Then she stepped down. Tall. That was his first thought. Nearly as tall as him, which was saying something. She wore a dark traveling dress that had seen better days. Her blonde hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. She carried a worn leather suitcase in one hand and a violin case in the other. And when she turned and looked directly at him, her eyes were the coldest shade of blue he'd ever seen. Elias felt something shift in his chest. Uncertainty, maybe. Or warning. He walked toward her. Miss Weiss? She looked him up and down slowly, taking in his dusty coat, his worn boots, the way his hands hung awkward at his sides. Her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're shorter than your photograph suggested. Elias blinked. What? Your photograph. She set down the violin case and pulled a crumpled paper from her coat pocket, the tintype he'd sent with his letter. She held it up, comparing the image to his face. Either you exaggerated, or the photographer was very generous. Heat crept up his neck. I'm 5'11". She tucked the photograph away. I suppose that will have to do. For a long moment, Elias just stared at her. In his entire life, no one had ever spoken to him like this. Not the ranch hands he employed, not the merchants in town, certainly not a woman who just traveled 2,000 miles to marry him. Your luggage, he finally managed. This is it. She gestured to the suitcase and violin. That's all? I don't believe in carrying unnecessary weight. She picked up the violin case. Shall we go, or do you intend to stand here examining me all afternoon? Elias grabbed her suitcase without answering and started toward the wagon. Behind him, he heard her footsteps, steady, unhesitating. Not the tentative steps of a woman entering unknown territory. The confident stride of someone who'd already decided she belonged here. The wagon ride to the ranch took 4 hours. Most of it in silence. Elias didn't mind silence. He preferred it. But this wasn't comfortable silence. This was the silence of 2 animals circling each other, trying to figure out who would strike first. Helena sat beside him on the bench, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't comment on the rough road or the way the wagon jolted over every rock. She just watched the landscape roll past, the golden grasslands, the distant mountains, the endless sky that seemed to swallow everything beneath it. It's empty, she said finally. That's Montana. In Germany, you're never more than a few kilometers from another village. She tilted her head. Here. It feels like the world has ended and no one bothered to tell the survivors. Elias glanced at her. You scared? Should I be? Most people are. First time they see how far out we are. Helena smiled then, a real smile, sharp and knowing. Mr. Norwood, I didn't come all this way to be frightened by empty land. I came because I was tired of crowded cities full of people who wanted to tell me how to live. I got rules too. I'm sure you do. She turned to face him fully. But I didn't agree to obey them. I agreed to marry you. There's a difference. Elias felt his jaw tighten. The letter said, The letter said you wanted a practical woman who could tolerate isolation and harsh winters. That's me. It said nothing about blind obedience. Most wives. I am not most wives. The certainty in her voice made something in Elias's chest constrict. He'd made a mistake. He'd known it the moment she stepped off that train, and now, sitting beside her in this wagon rolling toward his isolated ranch, he knew it with absolute clarity. This woman was going to ruin everything. They reached the ranch just as the sun started to set. The Norwood Ranch wasn't much. A sturdy log cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a corral for the horses, and thousands of acres of grassland stretching toward the mountains. Elias had built most of it himself over the past 8 years. It wasn't beautiful, but it was functional. That was all that mattered. Helena climbed down from the wagon before he could help her. She stood in the yard looking at the cabin, the barn, the empty land beyond. Well, she said, it's not going to collapse immediately. That's something. Elias grabbed her suitcase. It's solid. Withstood the winter of 81. How reassuring. She picked up her violin case and followed him toward the cabin. Inside, the single room was exactly as he'd left it. Rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a stove in the corner, a narrow bed against the far wall, shelves holding supplies, flour, beans, coffee, ammunition. Everything a man needed to survive. Helena set down the violin case and walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing over the table, the shelves, the cold stove. You live like a monk, she said. I live simple. Simple is one word for it. She turned to face him. Where do I sleep? Elias gestured toward the bed. Helena's eyebrows rose. And you? I'll make a bedroll by the stove. How noble. We ain't married yet. No, she agreed. We're not. The way she said it made Elias uneasy, like she was already reconsidering the entire arrangement, like she might walk back to town in the dark rather than spend one night in this cabin. There's a minister in Bozeman, he said. We can go back tomorrow if you want. Make it official. Helena walked to the window and looked out at the darkening valley. What's the hurry? Thought that's why you came. I came because I had nowhere else to go. She didn't turn around. My parents died last spring, cholera. I worked in a textile factory in New York for 6 months, but the foreman, she paused. Let's just say he believed women owed him more than labor. Elias felt anger flicker in his chest. He hurt you? He tried. Helena's voice was flat. I broke his nose with a spindle. Then I lost my job. Good. She turned, surprise crossing her face. Good? That you broke his nose. For the first time since they'd met, Helena looked at him with something other than skepticism. Not warmth exactly, but maybe the beginning of respect. I need to know something, she said. Are you a violent man? No. Are you a drunk? No. Do you believe you own me now that I'm here? Elias met her eyes. No. Then we might actually survive this. Helena crossed to the stove and opened it, examining the cold ashes inside. Do you have firewood? Outside. Good. I'll make dinner. You can tell me about the ranch. Elias stood frozen for a moment, completely off balance. He'd expected arguments or tears or demands to go back to town. He hadn't expected this. A woman who'd just traveled across the country, who'd walked into his rough cabin and immediately started giving orders. You can cook? He asked. Helena shot him a look that could have stripped paint. Mr. Norwood, I survived 2 years in a New York tenement and 6 months in a factory. Yes, I can cook, though I suspect your standards are somewhat lower than mine. Despite himself, Elias felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. That night they ate beans and cornbread at the rough wooden table. Helena had somehow made the simple meal taste better than anything Elias had cooked in years. She'd also found his coffee and made it strong enough to wake the dead. "You have mice," she said, breaking the silence. "I know. And the roof leaks over the bed. Only when it rains hard." "Wonderful." She took a sip of coffee. "Tell me about the ranch." So Elias talked, haltingly at first, then more easily. He told her about the cattle, the summer grazing in the high meadows, the brutal work of winter feeding. He explained the water rights, the neighboring ranchers, the constant threat of wolves and disease and weather that could kill an entire herd overnight. Helena listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes watching him across the table. "How many cattle?" she asked when he finished. 300 head, give or take. "And how many hands?" 2. Mexican brothers, Miguel and Carlos. They stay in the bunkhouse down by the creek during summer. Winter, they head south. "So in winter you're alone?" "Yeah." Helena leaned back in her chair. "That's why you wanted a wife, not for company, for survival." Elias felt exposed, like she'd just read something private. "I told you it was practical." "You did." She stood and started collecting the plates. "But practical doesn't mean easy, Mr. Norwood, and I'm not an easy woman." "I'm figuring that out." The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of hammering. He sat up from his bedroll by the stove, disoriented. Gray dawn light filtered through the window. The cabin was cold, and someone was hammering. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. Helena stood in the yard wearing a coat she must have dug out of her suitcase, attacking a section of broken fence with a hammer and nails she'd found in the barn. Her breath misted in the cold air. Her hair had come loose from its bun, falling around her face. "What are you doing?" Elias called. She didn't stop hammering. "Fixing this fence before your horses decide to take a morning walk to Canada." "That's ranch work." "Yes, I noticed." She drove another nail home with 3 efficient strikes. "I also noticed you live alone and don't have time to fix everything that breaks." Elias walked over to her. "I'll handle it." "I'm already handling it." "Women don't—" Helena spun to face him, the hammer still in her hand. "Don't! Don't tell me what women do or don't do. I've spent my entire life being told what women should be. Quiet, obedient, grateful. I'm none of those things. If you wanted a decoration, you should have been clearer in your letter." They stared at each other across the broken fence. Elias had a choice. He could assert authority, lay down rules, try to make this woman fit the shape he'd imagined. Or he could step back and let her be who she was. He chose the second option, mostly because he suspected the first would end with that hammer planted in his skull. "Fence posts need replacing too," he said. "Not just the rails." Helena's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something like approval. "Show me." They worked together through the morning. Elias demonstrated how to set a fence post properly, how to brace it, how to test if it would hold. Helena watched, asked questions, then did it herself. She was strong, not as strong as him, but strong enough, and she learned fast. By noon, they'd repaired 20 feet of fence. "You're bleeding," Elias said, noticing her hands. Helena glanced at her palms where blisters had formed and burst. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." She wiped her hands on her skirt. "In the factory, I worked 12 hours a day operating machinery that could take your fingers off if you blinked wrong. Blisters are nothing." Elias studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the way she held herself despite the obvious pain. He'd known hardship his entire life, had worn it like a coat so long he'd forgotten what softness felt like. But Helena's hardness was different, newer, still raw. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the rest of the ranch." They rode out that afternoon on his 2 horses, a gelding named Buck for him, and a mare named Rosie for Helena. Except Helena hadn't ridden much, which became obvious when Rosie decided to test her new rider by breaking into a trot. Helena held on, her knuckles white on the saddle horn, her whole body rigid. "Relax," Elias called. "Move with her." "I'm trying not to die. You ain't gonna die. You don't know that?" But she stayed on. And by the time they reached the high pasture where the cattle grazed, she'd stopped looking like she was about to be thrown to her death. The cattle spread across the golden grass like dark stones scattered by a giant hand. 300 head, just like he'd said. Mostly Herefords, sturdy and broad. They looked up as the horses approached, then went back to grazing. Helena pulled Rosie to a stop beside him. They're smaller than I expected. They're tough. That's what matters out here. She studied the herd with the same intensity she'd given everything else. The cabin, the fence, the land itself. How do you keep track of them? Brands? See the N on their hindquarters? He pointed. That's Norwood. Every rancher's got a registered brand. And in winter? We bring them down to the low pastures, feed them hay, pray we don't lose too many to the cold. Helena turned in her saddle to look at him. How many do you usually lose? Bad winter? 50, 60 head. That's nearly 20%. Math comes easy to you? I read. She said it like a challenge. Elias felt that shift in his chest again, that sense of the ground moving beneath him. Most people in the territory couldn't read beyond their own names, but Helena said it like it was obvious, like everyone should be able to calculate percentages and repair fences and refuse to be intimidated by empty land. What do you read? He asked. Everything I can get my hands on. Helena looked back at the cattle. During the train journey, I read 3 agricultural journals someone left in the passenger car. Do you know about rotational grazing? About what? Rotational grazing. Moving cattle between pastures to prevent overgrazing. It improves grass recovery and soil health. She gestured at the valley. You could divide this land into sections, rotate the herd every few weeks. You'd lose fewer cattle to poor forage in winter. Elias stared at her. You learned that from a journal? Yes. In 3 days? I'm a fast reader. For a long moment, Elias didn't know what to say. He'd been ranching for 8 years. He'd learned from experience, from other ranchers, from trial and error that sometimes cost him animals and money. And here was this woman who'd been in Montana for less than 2 days, telling him how to improve his operation based on something she'd read on a train. The worst part was, she was probably right. We'll talk about it, he said finally. Helena's smile was sharp. I'll take that as a victory. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Less wary. More something else. Something Elias didn't have a word for. That evening, after another dinner of simple food made better by Helena's cooking, they sat at the table with coffee. We should talk about the marriage, Helena said. Elias felt his shoulders tense. What about it? I want to be clear about expectations. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I'll keep house, cook, help with ranch work, but I won't be your property. I won't ask permission to speak or read or have opinions, and I won't share your bed unless I choose to. The bluntness of it made Elias's face heat. I told you. I know what you told me, but men say a lot of things before marriage. I need to know you meant them. Elias met her eyes across the table. I meant them. Good. Helena took a sip of coffee. Then we'll get along fine. That simple? Nothing simple, Mr. Norwood, but it can be clear. They went to town 2 days later to see the minister. The marriage ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. The minister, a tired man named Reverend Walsh, read from a worn prayer book while Helena and Elias stood in his small church. There were no flowers, no guests, just the two of them and the Reverend's wife as a witness. When it was done, Elias signed the certificate with his careful, unpracticed handwriting. Helena signed with a flourish that made him wonder how many other documents she'd signed in her life. Well, Reverend Walsh said, closing the book, you're married. May the Lord bless your union. Outside, the November wind cut through the street like a blade. Helena pulled her coat tighter. That's it then? Yeah. I'm Helena Norwood now. She tested the name. Strange. Elias didn't know what to say to that. It felt strange to him, too, the idea that this sharp-edged woman was now legally bound to him, that his isolated ranch, his simple life, had just gotten infinitely more complicated. They were halfway to the wagon when a voice called out, Elias, that you? Elias turned to see Thomas Garrett, owner of the ranch just north of his. Thomas was a big man with a bigger mouth, the kind of rancher who measured his success by how loudly he could talk about it. Thomas, Elias acknowledged. Thomas's eyes slid to Helena. This the mail-order bride I heard about? Elias felt his jaw tighten. This is my wife, Helena. Wife? Thomas's grin was oily. Well, ain't that something? You got yourself a tall one, didn't you? He looked Helena up and down. Where you from, girl? Helena's expression went cold. Germany. And I'm not a girl. Thomas laughed. Feisty, too. Elias, you got your hands full with this one. We need to get back, Elias said, taking Helena's elbow. But Helena didn't move. She was still looking at Thomas with those ice-blue eyes. Mr. Garrett, she said, if you speak to me like that again, I'll ensure you regret it. Are we clear? Thomas's smile faltered. Now wait just a... Are we clear? For a moment, Thomas just gaped at her. Then he laughed, but it sounded forced. Well, guess you got yourself a wild one, Elias. Good luck taming her. I don't need to be tamed, Helena said. I need to be left alone, which you should do, now. They walked to the wagon in tense silence. Elias helped Helena up. She didn't argue this time, then climbed up beside her. You just made an enemy, he said as they pulled away from town. I made a statement. Helena's hands were tight in her lap. Men like him think women are decorations or livestock. I won't pretend to be either. Thomas Garrett owns land on 3 sides of me. We share water rights. It pays to stay friendly. Then you stay friendly. She turned to look at him. I didn't come here to make your life easier, Elias. I came here to survive, and I survive by making sure men like that know exactly where they stand. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that frontier life required compromise, that you couldn't just challenge everyone who looked at you wrong. But he also remembered the way she'd fixed that fence, learned to ride despite being terrified, calculated percentages in her head. Helena Norwood wasn't going to bend. And maybe, Elias thought, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Winter came early that year. By late November, the first real snow had fallen, 6 inches overnight, transforming the brown grassland into a white expanse that stretched to the horizon. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. Helena adapted. She learned to dress in layers, to wrap her hands in wool before going outside, to move through the cabin quickly to conserve the heat from the stove. She also started reorganizing. First, the kitchen area. She rearranged the shelves, grouped supplies logically, created a workspace that made cooking less chaotic. Elias came in one afternoon to find everything in different places. What happened to my kitchen? He asked. It was a disaster. Now it's functional. Helena didn't look up from the bread dough she was kneading. You're welcome. I knew where everything was. You knew where everything was randomly scattered. There's a difference. Elias opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because she was right. The new system made sense. He just hadn't thought of it. Next, she tackled the barn. She found spare lumber and built proper shelves for the tack. She organized the tools, cleaned out corners that hadn't been touched in years, even fixed the door so it didn't stick every time you tried to open it. Miguel and Carlos, the ranch hands who'd stayed late this year to help with winter preparations, watched her work with barely concealed amazement. Your wife, Miguel said to Elias one morning as they repaired a cattle shelter, she's different. That's one word for it. She told Carlos his saddle was poorly maintained. Then she showed him how to oil the leather properly. Elias glanced toward the barn, where Helena was currently sweeping. She say it mean? No, that's the strange part. She was just factual. That was Helena. Factual, blunt, completely unable to pretend something was fine when it wasn't. It drove Elias half crazy, but it also made him talk more. At night, after dinner, Helena would ask questions about the ranch, about Montana, about his life before she arrived. And Elias, who'd spent years speaking only when necessary, found himself answering. Why'd you come here? She asked one evening. Norway got too crowded. Helena smiled. Norway, too crowded. I'd love to see that. Family farm was going to my older brother. Wasn't enough land for both of us, so I left. How old were you? 18. And you came all the way to Montana alone? Worked my way west, logging camps, mines, railroad crews, saved money, bought this land 8 years ago. Helena was quiet for a moment. Do you miss it? Norway? Elias thought about that. The green valleys, the cold ocean, the small house where he'd grown up. Sometimes, he admitted, but I wouldn't go back. Why not? Because here, I don't answer to anyone. Helena looked at him across the table. Except now you have a wife. Yeah. Elias met her eyes. Except now. Something passed between them in that moment. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. They were stuck with each other now. This silent Norwegian rancher and this stubborn German woman. And somehow, they were going to have to figure out how to live in the same small cabin without killing each other. December arrived with a blizzard. It hit on a Tuesday morning, roaring down from the mountains with wind that sounded like wolves. The temperature plummeted. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. Elias and Helena spent 3 days trapped inside while the storm raged. By the second day, the close quarters started to show. "You're pacing," Helena said without looking up from the book she was reading. "I'm checking the cabin." "You've checked the cabin 6 times in the last hour. Storm like this, you gotta be careful." "The cabin survived the winter of '81, remember? It'll survive this." She turned a page. "Sit down. You're making me nervous." Elias sat, then stood again, then sat. Helena finally closed her book. "Talk to me." "About what?" "Anything. Tell me about the worst winter you've seen." So Elias talked. About the winter of '81, when the snow piled 10 feet high and stayed until April. About losing nearly 100 cattle. About the loneliness that had settled into his bones like ice, making him wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake coming to this brutal territory. Helena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You're afraid of being alone." Elias stiffened. "I lived alone for years." "That doesn't mean you weren't afraid of it." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the wall of white beyond the glass. "I understand. In New York, I was surrounded by people every moment, thousands of them, but I felt completely alone, like I could disappear and no one would notice." "Is that why you answered my letter?" "Partly." Helena turned to face him. "But also because I was tired of feeling invisible. Here, in all this emptiness, at least I'm visible, even if it's only to you." Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he stood and walked to stand beside her at the window. They watched the storm together in silence. On the third day, the blizzard finally broke. Elias went out to check on the cattle and found 2 dead, frozen during the worst of the storm. He dragged them away from the others, his muscles screaming with the effort, his breath crystallizing in the air. When he came back to the cabin, Helena had coffee waiting. "Bad?" she asked. "Could have been worse." She handed him the cup. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "Thank you." He looked at her surprised. "For what?" "For not treating me like I'm fragile, for letting me work, for—" She paused. "For being exactly what you said you'd be." Elias felt something shift in his chest again. That same sensation he'd been feeling since she arrived. The ground moving, the world tilting. He'd wanted practical, he'd gotten practical, but he was starting to realize that practical didn't mean simple. And Helena Norwood was the least simple thing that had ever happened to him. Christmas approached. Elias had never celebrated much, usually just a slightly better dinner and an extra cup of whiskey. But Helena had other ideas. She started gathering pine branches during her rides, bringing them back to the cabin in bundles. She made ribbons from scraps of fabric she'd brought in her suitcase. She even somehow produced ingredients he didn't know they had. Dried cranberries, honey, spices. "What are you doing?" he asked, watching her transform the cabin. "Making it Christmas." "Why?" Helena paused, a pine branch in her hands. "Because we're alive. Because we survived the blizzard. Because sometimes, Elias, you have to celebrate the small victories or the big defeats will crush you." On Christmas morning, Elias woke to find the cabin transformed. Pine branches lined the window frames. Candles burned on the table. Real candles, not the cheap tallow ones he usually used. The smell of baking bread filled the air. And Helena stood by the stove wearing a green dress he'd never seen before. Her hair down around her shoulders for the first time since she'd arrived. She looked beautiful. The thought hit him like a punch to the chest. "Merry Christmas," she said, turning to smile at him. Elias couldn't speak. Because in that moment, looking at this woman in his cabin, this stubborn, sharp-edged woman who'd reorganized his kitchen and fixed his fences and refused to be anything other than exactly who she was, he felt something crack open inside him. Something dangerous, something that felt almost like hope. "Merry Christmas," he finally managed. They ate breakfast together, real eggs somehow, and fresh bread with honey. Helena had been saving ingredients, planning this. The cabin was warm, the coffee was strong. Outside, snow fell gently, and for the first time in years, Elias Norwood didn't feel alone. After breakfast, Helena handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" "A gift. Open it." Listen. Inside, he found a pair of gloves she'd sewn herself from leather scraps and lined with wool. The stitching was careful, precise, clearly the work of someone who'd spent years sewing in factories. "Your gloves had holes," she said. "I noticed." Elias turned them over in his hands, something tight in his throat. "Helena, they're practical. Don't make it into something it's not." But it was something. They both knew it. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "I got you something too." Helena unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a wooden comb he'd carved during the long evenings while she'd read. It wasn't fancy, his whittling skills were limited, but he'd sanded it smooth and rubbed it with oil until the wood gleamed. Helena ran her fingers over it, her expression unreadable. "You made this," she said quietly. "It's not much. It's perfect." They stood in the warm cabin, holding their gifts, and the silence between them was full of things neither of them could say. That afternoon, Helena pulled out her violin for the first time since arriving. "I haven't played in months," she said, rosening the bow. "I'll probably be terrible." "Play anyway." She did. The music filled the cabin, a German folk song, simple and haunting. Helena played with her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly, and Elias sat at the table, coffee forgotten, listening to sounds he'd never expected to hear in his rough Montana cabin. When she finished, she lowered the violin and opened her eyes. "Well?" she asked. "Play another." She smiled, a real smile without the sharpness, and began again. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the cabin was warm and bright and filled with music. And somewhere between the first note and the last, something fundamental shifted between them. They weren't just two people stuck together by circumstance anymore. They were becoming something else, something neither of them had a name for yet. But it was there, growing, like the first green shoots pushing through snow, fragile and impossible to ignore. That night, after the candles had burned down and the cabin had grown dark, Elias lay in his bedroll by the stove and listened to Helena's breathing from the bed across the room. He'd wanted practical. He'd gotten Helena. And the truth was, he couldn't imagine the cabin without her anymore, without her sharp comments and her endless questions and her stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. Somewhere in the darkness, Helena spoke. "Elias?" "Yeah? Thank you for today. You're the one who did all the work. I meant thank you for being here, for..." She paused. "For seeing me." Elias stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding. "I see you," he said quietly. And in the darkness of the cabin, on Christmas night in the Montana wilderness, that felt like the most honest thing he'd ever said. The week after Christmas, the temperature dropped so low the nails in the cabin walls cracked and popped like gunshots. Elias woke before dawn to feed the stove, his breath visible even inside. Helena was already up, wrapped in a quilt, boiling water for coffee. They'd fallen into this routine without discussing it, moving around each other in the small space, anticipating needs, working in tandem. "Cattle?" she asked. "I'll check after breakfast." She nodded and cracked 4 eggs into the pan. Real eggs were a luxury out here, but Helena had convinced him to keep chickens. She'd built the coop herself from scrap lumber, ignoring his protests that it was a waste of time. Now they had eggs every morning. Elias sat at the table and watched her cook. She moved with efficiency, no wasted motion. Factory work had taught her that. But there was something else now, a comfort in this space that hadn't been there before Christmas. Like the cabin had become hers too, not just the place she was stuck. "Thomas Garrett stopped by yesterday," she said, sliding eggs onto his plate. Elias looked up sharply. "When?" "While you were fixing the fence line. He wanted to borrow tools." "What'd you tell him?" "I told him you weren't here and he should come back another time." Helena sat across from him with her own plate. "He didn't like that." "What'd he say?" "That it was unusual for a wife to speak for her husband, that most women knew their place. She cut into her eggs. I told him most men knew better than to show up uninvited and make demands. Elias put down his fork. Helena, don't. She met his eyes. Don't tell me I should have been nicer. He came here to test me, to see if you'd broken me in yet like a green horse. I made it clear that wasn't happening. He's going to talk. Let him talk. This territory's small. Reputation matters. Helena's jaw tightened. Then maybe men should stop treating women like property and start treating us like people. Maybe then reputation wouldn't be a problem. They ate in tense silence. Elias knew she was right, but he also knew how frontier communities worked. Word spread fast, and a wife who talked back, who refused to play the role expected of her, could make life difficult for both of them. But looking at Helena across the table, her spine straight, her eyes defiant, he also knew she'd never bend. Not for him, not for Thomas Garrett, not for anyone. And part of him, the part he didn't want to examine too closely, admired the hell out of her for it. 2 weeks into January, Miguel and Carlos returned to help with winter feeding. They found the ranch transformed. The barn was organized. The fences were repaired. The chicken coop stood sturdy against the wind, and Helena was in the corral working with Rosie on figure eights at a trot. "Boss," Miguel said, watching Helena ride, "your wife is—" "I know," Elias said. "She's better than most men I've worked with." "I know that too." Carlos approached the fence, leaning on the rail. Helena brought Rosie to a walk, then a stop. "Mrs. Norwood," Carlos called, "your seat's improved." Helena dismounted, slightly breathless. "I'm tired of being afraid of falling. Figured I should just learn properly." "Who taught you?" "Myself. And a book I found in town about cavalry training." Miguel and Carlos exchanged glances. Then Miguel started laughing, not mocking, but genuine amusement. "What?" Helena asked, leading Rosie toward them. "Nothing, Senora. Just, you read a cavalry manual to learn to ride?" It was very informative about posture and balance. I'm sure it was. Miguel was still grinning, but cavalry soldiers don't ride side saddle. "Neither do I," Helena said flatly. "Not anymore." Elias saw both men register what she meant. Helena was riding astride like a man. In split skirts she'd sewn herself because proper riding skirts were expensive and impractical. "Your wife," Miguel said quietly to Elias later, "is going to scandalize every woman in the territory." "Probably." "You worried about that?" Elias thought about it. A month ago, he would have been. But now, watching Helena work alongside the men without complaint, hauling feed and checking cattle and refusing to pretend she was delicate, he found he didn't care what anyone else thought. "No," he said, "I'm not." The real trouble started in mid-January when they rode into Bozeman for supplies. Elias needed lumber, nails, and grain. Helena needed fabric and sewing supplies. They'd made the trip in the wagon, the cold so intense their breath froze to their scarves. At the general store, while Elias dealt with the lumber order, Helena browsed the fabric. Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, watched her with barely concealed disapproval. "Mrs. Norwood," she said finally, "I heard you've been riding astride." Helena didn't look up from the bolt of wool she was examining. "You heard correctly. That's most improper. It's most practical." "But what will people think?" Helena set down the fabric and turned to face Mrs. Patterson. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't particularly care what people think. I care about not breaking my neck because some long-dead man decided women should ride side saddle to preserve modesty. Modesty doesn't help when you're thrown from a horse." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed. "Well, I suppose frontier life requires certain compromises. It requires common sense." Helena picked up the wool again. "I'll take 3 yards of this, please." At the counter, while Mrs. Patterson cut the fabric with tight, angry movements, 2 other women entered the store. Both stopped when they saw Helena. "Is that the Norwood bride?" one whispered, not quietly enough. "Must be. Look at her hands. Rough as a man's." "I heard she does ranch work. Can you imagine?" Helena's expression didn't change, but Elias saw her fingers tighten on her reticule. He stepped closer, a silent presence at her back. Mrs. Patterson wrapped the fabric without speaking. "Helena paid?" took her package, and walked out with her head high. In the wagon, heading home, she was quiet. "You okay?" Elias asked. "Fine." "Helena." She turned to look at him, and he saw something raw in her eyes. Not hurt, exactly, but something close to it. "I knew it would be like this," she said. "I knew they'd whisper and judge, but knowing it and experiencing it are different things. They're just talking. I don't care about the talking. I care that they think I'm strange for wanting to be useful, for refusing to sit in a cabin all day doing nothing while you work yourself to death." She looked out at the frozen landscape. "In New York, I was strange because I could read. Here, I'm strange because I can work. I'm starting to think I'll be strange everywhere." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Good." Helena looked at him sharply. "Good? If you weren't strange, you'd be like everyone else. Scared to try anything different. Scared to be anything more than what people expect." He met her eyes. "I don't want you to be like everyone else." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but softer than her usual sharpness. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it. I wouldn't dream of it." But for the rest of the ride home, she sat a little closer to him on the wagon bench. And when the cold wind picked up, Elias draped a blanket over both their laps without asking. Small things. But they mattered. February brought a brief warming trend that turned the snow to slush and made everything muddy. It also brought visitors. Elias was repairing a water trough when he saw the riders approaching, 3 men on horseback. He recognized them immediately. Thomas Garrett and 2 of his ranch hands. Helena was in the barn. Elias whistled sharply, their signal. She appeared in the doorway, saw the riders, and came to stand beside him. "Stay calm," Elias murmured. "I'm always calm." Thomas reined in his horse just outside the corral. His 2 men flanked him, both armed. That wasn't unusual. Everyone went armed in the territory, but it felt deliberate. "Elias," Thomas said, "got a minute?" "What do you need?" "Need to talk about water rights. This warm spell's got the creek running high. You're taking more than your share." Elias felt anger flicker. "I'm taking exactly what I'm entitled to." "That's not what I'm seeing." "Then you're not looking right." Thomas's smile was cold. "Maybe we should ride down and settle this, man to man. We can settle it right here." "See, that's the problem." Thomas's eyes slid to Helena. "Used to be you were reasonable. Now you've got someone whispering in your ear telling you how to run your ranch." Helena stepped forward. "Mr. Garrett, if you have a problem with water allocation, there are legal channels. I wasn't talking to you." "Then you should have come when my husband was alone." Her voice was ice. "Since you didn't, you're talking to both of us." Thomas's face darkened. "Elias, you gonna let your wife speak for you?" Elias moved to stand beside Helena. "She's right. You got a problem with water rights. Take it to the territorial office. Otherwise, get off my land." For a long moment, nobody moved. The 2 ranch hands looked uncomfortable. Thomas looked furious. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally. "Yeah, it is." Thomas yanked his horse around and spurred it hard. His men followed. They disappeared down the road at a gallop, leaving deep tracks in the mud. Helena let out a breath. "He's going to make trouble." "Probably." "I'm sorry." Elias turned to look at her. "For what?" "For making it worse. If I'd stayed quiet, then he would have pushed harder." Elias shook his head. "Thomas Garrett's been looking for a fight since I got here. This was coming whether you spoke up or not. Still." "Helena." He waited until she met his eyes. "I'm glad you spoke up. I'm tired of men like him thinking they can walk all over people." She studied his face. "You mean that?" "Yeah, I do." Something passed between them, an understanding maybe, or recognition. They were on the same side now. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That night over dinner, Helena asked, "What's the water situation actually like?" Elias explained. The creek that ran through both properties had been divided by territorial agreement when the ranches were established. Each ranch got half the flow, but water rights were complicated, especially during dry years or when one rancher wanted to expand. "So legally, you're entitled to what you're taking?" Helena asked. "Yeah." "Then why is he pushing?" "Because he wants more land, and if he can drive me out, he can buy my ranch cheap." Helena set down her fork. How much does he need to expand? Doesn't need it. Wants it. Thomas Garrett always wants more. And if you don't sell? Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he'll keep pushing until something breaks. Helena's jaw set in that way he'd learned to recognize. She was thinking, planning, calculating angles he probably hadn't considered. Then we don't break, she said. Over the next few weeks, Helena threw herself into learning everything about the ranch. She rode the property lines with Miguel, memorizing landmarks and boundary markers. She studied the water rights documents Elias kept in a wooden box. She even started a ledger, tracking cattle numbers, feed costs, and income in neat columns. You don't have to do this, Elias said one evening, watching her work by candlelight. I know. She didn't look up from the ledger. But if someone's going to try to take this ranch, I want to know exactly what we're fighting for. We? She finally looked up. Yes, we. This is my home too now. Or did you think I'd just stand aside if trouble came? Elias sat across from her. Most women would. I'm not most women, Elias. I thought we'd established that. Yeah, he said quietly. We did. Helena went back to her numbers, but Elias saw the small smile at the corner of her mouth. March arrived with more snow and bitter cold. Cabin fever set in hard. The walls felt closer. The silence heavier. Elias caught himself pacing again, restless and irritable. Helena handled it differently. She threw herself into projects, mending every piece of clothing they owned, reorganizing the pantry for the third time, even starting to teach herself rudimentary carpentry from a book she'd bought in town. What are you building? Elias asked, watching her measure boards in the barn. Shelves? For books. What books? The ones I'm going to buy. Eventually. She marked a measurement. I'm tired of having nothing to read. You've got that cavalry manual. I've read it 6 times, Elias. I could teach cavalry maneuvers in my sleep at this point. Despite himself, he smiled. What kind of books you want? She paused, the pencil still in her hand. Everything. Novels, histories, agricultural journals, scientific papers, anything that's not about surviving from one day to the next. That's all we do out here. Survive. No. Helena set down the pencil and turned to face him. That's all you've been doing. But surviving isn't the same as living. What's the difference? Living means looking forward to something, planning for more than just getting through winter, building something that matters. She gestured around the barn. You've got land, cattle, a home, but what are you building toward? Elias didn't have an answer. For 8 years, he'd measured success by simple metrics. How many cattle survived, whether the roof held through another winter, if he had enough supplies to last until spring. He'd never thought beyond that. I don't know, he admitted. Helena walked over to him. Then maybe it's time to figure it out. That night, they sat at the table with coffee and paper. Helena had her ledger. Elias had a rough map he'd drawn of the ranch. If we're going to make this work long term, Helena said, we need a plan. What kind of plan? Expansion, improvement, making this ranch profitable enough that people like Thomas Garrett can't push us around. She opened the ledger. Right now, you're breaking even most years. Good years, you make a small profit. Bad years, you lose money. That's ranching. That's gambling. There's a difference. She pointed to her numbers. But if we diversify, chickens for eggs, maybe pigs, a larger garden, we could create additional income streams. And if we implement that rotational grazing I mentioned, we could support more cattle on the same land. Elias studied her calculations. This would take years. So, we have years. And money we don't have. We have some. And we can save more if we're careful. Helena met his eyes. Elias, I didn't come here to barely survive. I came here to build something. Are you with me or not? He looked at her across the table. This woman who'd stepped off a train 3 months ago and turned his entire life upside down, who refused to be quiet or obedient or anything other than exactly who she was, who looked at his rough ranch and saw potential instead of just hardship. I'm with you, he said. Helena's smile was bright and fierce. Good, then let's get to work. They started small. Helena expanded the chicken coop and bought 6 more hens. She planted early vegetables in a cold frame she built using scrap glass. She even convinced Elias to buy 2 pigs, which she claimed would pay for themselves within a year. Miguel and Carlos watched these changes with interest. "Your wife," Miguel said one afternoon, "she thinks like a businessman." "She thinks like someone who survived New York," Elias replied. "That explains it." The pigs arrived in early April, two young sows that Helena immediately named Greta and Liesel, after characters in a German folktale. She built them a pen, researched their diet, and kept meticulous notes on their growth. "You name the pigs," Elias said, watching her feed them. "They're living creatures. They deserve names. We're going to eat them eventually." "Not these two. These are breeding stock." Helena scratched Greta behind the ear. "We'll eat their offspring." "You've got this all planned out." "Of course I do. Planning is how you succeed." She looked at him. "You built this ranch without a plan. Imagine what you could do with one." April brought the first real thaw. The snow retreated, revealing brown grass and mud and the frozen carcasses of animals that hadn't survived winter. It also brought more visitors. This time, it was women from town. 3 of them arrived in a wagon one afternoon while Elias was out checking fence lines. Helena was in the garden, turning soil, when she heard the wagon approach. She recognized 2 of them from the general store. The third was younger, maybe 20, with kind eyes. "Mrs. Norwood," the older woman said. Her name was Mrs. Fletcher. "We've come to call." Helena stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "That's precisely why we came. We thought you might be lonely out here." Helena doubted that was the real reason, but she led them inside anyway. The cabin was clean but sparse, nothing like the decorated parlors these women probably maintained in town. Mrs. Fletcher looked around with barely concealed judgment. "How rustic." "It's functional," Helena said, putting on water for tea. "Don't you find it isolating, being so far from town?" "No, I find it peaceful." The second woman, Mrs. Chen, spoke up. "We've heard you do ranch work. Is that true?" "Yes." "That must be difficult. Surely your husband could hire help." "He has help, Miguel and Carlos. I work because I want to." The 3 women exchanged glances. The younger one, Miss Sarah, looked curious rather than judgmental. "What kind of work?" Sarah asked. "Whatever needs doing, fencing, feeding cattle, maintaining equipment, building." "Building?" "I built the chicken coop and the pig pen. I'm learning carpentry." Mrs. Fletcher's lips thinned. "Mrs. Norwood, surely you understand that such behavior reflects poorly on your husband. People are talking." Helena poured tea into mismatched cups. "Let them talk." "But don't you care about your reputation?" "Not particularly." Helena handed out the cups. "Mrs. Fletcher, I came to Montana to escape people who wanted to control how I lived. I'm not interested in trading one set of expectations for another. But there are standards." "Whose standards? Yours? The town's?" Helena sat down. "I'm not interested in pretending to be helpless so other people feel comfortable. If that bothers you, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to change." The silence was thick. Mrs. Chen looked shocked. Mrs. Fletcher looked angry. But Sarah was smiling, a small, secret smile. "Well," Mrs. Fletcher said stiffly, "I can see we've wasted our time." They left shortly after, their tea barely touched, but Sarah lingered at the wagon. "Mrs. Norwood," she said quietly, "I think what you're doing is brave." Helena was surprised. "Thank you. I'm supposed to marry Thomas Garrett's nephew next month. Everyone says I'm lucky, but—" She glanced back at the other women in the wagon. "I don't feel lucky. I feel trapped." "Then don't marry him." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You just have to be willing to deal with the consequences." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Then she climbed into the wagon without another word. That evening, when Elias came home, Helena told him about the visit. "They came to inspect you," he said. "I know." "And you told them you don't care what they think." "I don't." Elias sat across from her. "Helena, this is a small community. Making enemies. I'm not making enemies. I'm refusing to pretend to be something I'm not." She met his eyes. "If people can't accept that, it's their problem, not mine. It becomes our problem when they make life difficult. Then we deal with it together." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that frontier life required compromise, that you couldn't just challenge every social norm without consequences. But he also remembered the way she'd stood up to Thomas Garrett, the way she'd worked alongside him through the brutal winter, the way she'd looked at his rough ranch and decided to make it better instead of just enduring it. "You're right," he said finally. Helena blinked. "What?" "You're right. We deal with it together. And if people don't like how you live, that's their problem." For a moment, Helena just stared at him. Then she smiled, that real smile, without sharpness. "Who are you, and what have you done with Elias Norwood?" "Maybe I'm learning." "From me?" "Don't let it go to your head." Too late. But she was still smiling, and so was he. May arrived with warmth and green grass and calving season. The cattle started dropping calves in the high pasture, which meant long days checking on them, helping difficult births, protecting newborns from predators. Elias barely slept, riding out before dawn and not returning until dark. Helena rode with him when she could, learning to spot a cow in labor, how to assist if needed, how to defend a calf from coyotes. She was getting better with a rifle, though she hated using it. "I don't like killing things," she said after shooting a coyote that had gotten too close to a newborn calf. "Neither do I. But sometimes you don't have a choice." "There's always a choice." "Yeah, and sometimes all the choices are bad." One afternoon, they found a cow in serious trouble. She'd been in labor too long, exhausted and suffering. Elias examined her and knew immediately what they were facing. "Breach," he said. "Calf's coming backwards." Helena dismounted. "What do we do? I can try to turn it, but—" He didn't finish, but there was a good chance he'd lose both the cow and the calf. "Try," Helena said. Elias worked for over an hour while Helena held the cow's head, murmuring to her in German. His arms ached, his shoulders screamed, but finally he felt the calf shift. "Got it," he gasped. 10 minutes later, the calf was born, wet and weak, but alive. The cow stumbled to her feet and immediately started cleaning her baby. Elias sat back in the grass, exhausted, covered in blood and birth fluid. Helena knelt beside him. "You saved them both." "We saved them." "I just held her head. You kept her calm. That matters." They sat in the grass together, watching the calf struggle to stand on wobbly legs. The sun was setting, painting the valley gold and orange. "This is why you do it," Helena said quietly. "What?" "This. All of it. The hard work, the isolation, the constant struggle." She gestured at the cow and calf. "For moments like this." Elias looked at her. Dirt smudged her face. Her dress was ruined. Her hair had come completely loose from its bun. She looked exhausted and messy and completely beautiful. "Yeah," he said. "This is why." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence. And when they reached the cabin, Helena went inside to clean up while Elias took care of the horses. He was brushing down Buck when Miguel found him. "Boss, we got a problem." Elias looked up. "What?" "Thomas Garrett's men cut our fence line, down by the creek." The anger that flared in Elias's chest was immediate and hot. "When?" "Today, while you were out with the cattle. Carlos found it an hour ago." Elias handed Miguel the brush. "Show me." The fence line was destroyed. 30 feet of posts pulled up, wire cut and tangled. It was deliberate sabotage, designed to let cattle drift onto Garrett's land, giving him an excuse to claim trespassing. Helena had followed them down, despite Miguel trying to convince her to stay at the cabin. "This is vandalism," she said, examining the cut wire. "This is Thomas Garrett making his move," Elias said. "What do we do?" Elias looked at the destroyed fence, then at the creek flowing beside it. At his land, the ranch he'd built with 8 years of backbreaking work, the home he and Helena were trying to make into something more than just survival. "We rebuild it," he said, "and then we go to town and file a formal complaint." "Will that do anything?" "Probably not, but it creates a record, shows we're not backing down." Helena nodded. "Then let's get started." They worked through the night by lantern light, setting new posts, stringing new wire. Miguel and Carlos helped, the 4 of them working in determined silence. By dawn, the fence was repaired, and Elias knew, looking at his exhausted wife, that whatever came next, they'd face it the same way they'd faced everything else. Together, stubborn and unbreaking. 3 days after they repaired the fence, Helena woke with a headache. She ignored it at first, pushing through breakfast preparations and morning chores. But by midday, her head was pounding so hard she could barely see straight. Her skin felt hot and tight. Elias found her leaning against the barn wall, eyes closed. "Helena?" "I'm fine, just tired." He touched her forehead and pulled back immediately. "You're burning up. It's just the sun. It's 8 in the morning and you're in the shade." He took her arm. "Come on, inside." She wanted to argue, but the world tilted when she tried to walk. Elias caught her, and the worry in his face scared her more than the fever. By that afternoon, she was delirious. Elias laid her in the bed and covered her with blankets, even though she was already sweating. She thrashed and mumbled in German, words he couldn't understand. Her fever climbed higher. "Miguel," Elias said when the ranch hand came to check on them, "I need you to ride to town. Get the doctor." "Boss, Doc Morrison's gone to Helena. Won't be back for a week." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. "Then find someone who knows medicine. Anyone." Miguel left at a gallop. Elias sat beside the bed and wrung out a cloth in cool water, pressing it to Helena's forehead. She didn't seem to notice. The hours crawled past. Helena's fever spiked higher. She stopped thrashing and went terribly still, her breathing shallow and rapid. Elias had seen this before, in logging camps, on cattle drives. Fever that climbed until it burned a person from the inside out. He'd watched men die this way. "Don't you dare," he said, changing the cloth again. "You hear me, Helena? Don't you dare die on me now." She didn't respond. Miguel returned after dark with Mrs. Chen, the woman who'd visited weeks earlier. She took one look at Helena and shook her head. "How long has she been like this?" "Since this morning." "And the fever?" "Getting worse." Mrs. Chen opened her bag and pulled out various herbs and tinctures. "I can try to bring the fever down, but Mr. Norwood, you need to understand, if it doesn't break in the next day or two, there's nothing more I can do." "Then we bring it down," Elias said. Mrs. Chen worked through the night, making teas from willow bark and other herbs Elias didn't recognize. She got some of the liquid down Helena's throat, then showed Elias how to continue the cool compresses. "Keep her wet," Mrs. Chen said. "The water draws out the heat. And talk to her. Sometimes they can hear even when they seem unconscious." After Mrs. Chen left, Elias sat beside the bed in the dark cabin. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Inside, the only sound was Helena's labored breathing. He wrung out the cloth and pressed it to her forehead again. "Remember when you told me I lived like a monk?" he said quietly. "You were right. I did. For years, I told myself I didn't need anything more than this cabin and the work, that being alone was better than letting anyone close enough to hurt me." He changed the cloth. "But then you showed up with your violin and your sharp tongue and your complete inability to do anything the easy way. And you wrecked everything, Helena. You came into my simple life and made it complicated and messy and so much better than it was before." Her breathing hitched. Elias leaned closer. "You have to fight this. You hear me? You're the strongest person I know. You survived New York. You survived that bastard at the factory. You survived me. You're not dying from some damn fever." Through the night, he's kept up the compresses, the herbs, the constant vigil. He barely slept. When he did doze, he jerked awake moments later in panic, checking to make sure she was still breathing. Miguel brought food he didn't eat. Carlos offered to take over the watch. Elias refused. The second day was worse. Helena's fever climbed higher. She stopped responding entirely, her skin pale beneath the flush of sickness. Elias found himself bargaining with nothing, with the empty air, with whatever force governed life and death. He'd take her sharp comments, her stubborn arguments, her refusal to be anything he expected. Just let her live. On the third morning, exhausted and desperate, Elias remembered the books. Helena had brought a small trunk of books from New York. She'd unpacked them carefully that first week, stacking them on a shelf she'd built. She'd read from them every night, sometimes aloud when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Elias retrieved the trunk and pulled out the first book, a worn volume of German poetry. He couldn't read German, but he opened it anyway and started reading aloud, stumbling over the unfamiliar words, probably butchering the pronunciation. It didn't matter. Helena had said she missed hearing her language, so he gave it to her. For hours, he read. German poetry, then a novel, then what looked like a scientific text about agriculture. His voice grew hoarse, his eyes burned, but he kept reading. At some point on the third night, he fell asleep in the chair beside the bed, the book still open in his lap. He woke to silence. Panic shot through him. He lunged forward, pressing his hand to Helena's chest, terrified he'd find no heartbeat. But she was breathing, slower, steadier, and when he touched her forehead, the skin was cooler. The fever had broken. Elias slumped back in the chair, relief so intense it made him shake. He pressed his hands to his face and felt wetness there. He was crying. When was the last time he'd cried? He couldn't remember. Helena slept for another full day. Real sleep this time, not the unconsciousness of fever. When she finally opened her eyes, evening light was slanting through the cabin window. Elias? Her voice was barely a whisper. He was beside her in an instant. Don't try to talk, you've been sick. How long? 4 days. She tried to sit up. He pushed her gently back down. Water, she said. He held a cup to her lips while she drank, then laid her back against the pillows. I heard you, she said after a moment. Heard what? Reading. In German. Her eyes focused on his face. You stayed with me. Of course I did. The whole time? Yeah. Something moved across her face, an emotion he couldn't quite read. Thank you. Helena, He stopped, not knowing how to finish, how to explain what he'd felt watching her fight for her life. How the thought of losing her had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed forever. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak but steady. I know, she said quietly. And maybe she did. Recovery was slow. Helena spent 2 weeks mostly in bed, frustrated by her own weakness. Elias brought her meals, read to her, helped her walk when she was finally strong enough to try. I hate this, she said one afternoon, leaning heavily on his arm as they made a circuit of the cabin. Being helpless. You're not helpless. You're healing. There's a difference. It feels the same. It's not. He guided her back to the bed. You fought off a fever that should have killed you. That's not helpless. That's stubborn as hell. She smiled weakly. I suppose I am stubborn. I'm counting on it. June arrived with full summer heat and Helena regaining her strength. The first time she made it out to the barn without assistance, Miguel cheered. Señora, you scared us half to death. I scared myself, Helena admitted, but I'm fine now. You're tougher than most men I know, Carlos said. Don't tell them that. Their egos can't handle it. The men laughed, and Helena felt something settle back into place. She was home. She'd survived, and she wasn't going to waste the second chance. But while Helena had been sick, Thomas Garrett had been busy. Elias discovered it when he rode into town for supplies. The Territorial Land Office had received a petition signed by Thomas Garrett and 8 other ranchers, claiming that Elias Norwood had been diverting more than his allocated water share and allowing his cattle to graze on neighboring land. All lies, but lies with official documentation. This is dated 3 weeks ago, Elias said, staring at the papers. While I was dealing with Helena's fever, the clerk, a nervous man named Peterson, wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm required to investigate all claims, Mr. Norwood. If you can provide evidence that these allegations are false, how am I supposed to provide evidence against lies? Survey records, witness testimony, documentation of your water usage? I don't document every bucket of water I pull from the creek. Nobody does. Peterson shuffled papers. Then this becomes more difficult. Elias left the office barely containing his rage. He found Miguel and Carlos at the saloon and told them what happened. This is bad, boss, Miguel said. If they rule against you, they could reduce your water allocation, maybe even your grazing rights. I know. What are you going to do? Elias thought about Helena, still weak but getting stronger every day. About the ranch they'd been building together. About the plans she'd made, the future she'd envisioned. I'm going to fight, he said. When he got home and told Helena, she was furious. While I was sick, that coward waited until you were distracted to make his move? Looks like it. She paced the cabin, still moving carefully, but with more energy than she'd had in weeks. We need documentation, records, proof that we've been using only our allocated water. I don't have that. Then we create it, starting now. She grabbed paper and a pencil. We'll document everything: water usage, grazing patterns, cattle movements. We'll create such detailed records that no one can question our practices. Helena, that won't help with the current petition. No, but it will help with the next one. Because there will be a next one. Men like Thomas Garrett don't stop after one attempt. She was right. Elias knew it. So they started documenting everything, writing down every detail of ranch operations, tracking water usage, mapping grazing areas. It was tedious work, but Helena approached it with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. 2 weeks later, the territorial office sent an investigator. His name was William Hayes, and he arrived with a clipboard and a superior attitude. He spent 3 days on the ranch, measuring water flow, inspecting fence lines, counting cattle. Helena shadowed him the entire time, answering his questions with precise detail and showing him the documentation they'd started. "You're quite involved in ranch operations, Mrs. Norwood," Hayes said on the second day. "It's my ranch, too. Most wives don't concern themselves with such matters. I'm not most wives." Hayes made a note on his clipboard. "So I'm gathering." On the final day, Hayes requested a meeting with Elias and Helena together. They sat at the kitchen table while Hayes reviewed his notes. "I've completed my investigation," he said. "Based on my observations and the testimony of your ranch hands, I find no evidence that you've exceeded your water allocation or allowed cattle to graze inappropriately on neighboring land." Relief flooded through Elias. "However," Hayes continued, "the petition was signed by multiple ranchers. That suggests widespread concern about your practices. I recommend you maintain detailed records going forward to prevent future disputes." "We're already doing that," Helena said, gesturing to her ledgers. Hayes looked impressed despite himself. "Then you should have no further problems. I'll file my report with the territorial office within the week." After he left, Helena sagged against the table. "We won," she said. "This round. Then we'll win the next round too." She looked at him. "We're not going anywhere, Elias. This is our home, and I'll be damned if I let Thomas Garrett take it." The fierceness in her voice made something warm spread through his chest. "Yeah," he said. "We will." July brought brutally hot weather and preparations for the summer cattle drive. The high pastures were at their greenest, and it was time to move the herd up into the mountains for better grazing. Helena insisted on going, despite still not being at full strength. "You're not recovered enough," Elias argued. "I'm strong enough to ride. That's all I need. It's 3 days hard riding, sleeping on the ground, no shelter if weather turns bad. I've survived worse." "Helena, I'm going, Elias. You can argue or you can accept it. Either way, I'm saddling Rosie at dawn." So they went. Helena, Elias, Miguel, and Carlos, driving 300 head of cattle into the high country. It was hard work, long days in the saddle, dust everywhere, constant vigilance against predators and stragglers. But it was also beautiful. The mountains rose around them, still snow-capped even in July. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadows. Eagles circled overhead. At night, they camped under stars so thick you could barely see the darkness between them. On the second night, sitting around the campfire after dinner, Miguel pulled out a battered guitar and started playing. "I didn't know you played," Helena said. "My father taught me." Miguel's fingers moved across the strings, coaxing out a melody that was both sad and sweet. Carlos sang along in Spanish, his voice surprisingly good. Helena listened with her eyes closed, swaying slightly to the music. When the song ended, she looked at Elias. "Do you sing?" "No." "Ever?" "Not if I can help it." She smiled. "Good. I've heard Norwegian folk songs. They're depressing." Miguel laughed and started another song. This one was faster, happier. Carlos stood and pulled Helena to her feet, showing her the steps to a Mexican dance despite her protests. Elias watched from across the fire. Helena was laughing, breathless, spinning in the firelight with her hair coming loose from its braid. She looked younger, freer. Not the woman who'd stepped off that train 9 months ago, guarded and sharp, but someone who'd found something worth staying for. She caught his eye across the flames and smiled, and Elias felt his chest constrict with an emotion he'd been avoiding naming for months. He was in love with her, completely, irrevocably in love with his stubborn, impossible wife. The realization should have terrified him. For 34 years, he'd avoided any attachment that could hurt him. He'd kept people at arm's length, told himself that solitude was strength. But looking at Helena now, he couldn't regret it, even if it scared him, even if he had no idea how to tell her. They reached the high pasture on the third day and spent the afternoon settling the herd. The cattle spread across the green meadow, finally able to graze without fighting over sparse grass. "This is good land," Helena said, surveying the valley. "Best summer grazing in the territory," Elias agreed. "How long do they stay?" "Until September. Then we bring them back down before the first snow." Helena was quiet for a moment. "I want to come back here. In the fall. Help with the drive down." "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." She looked at him. "I want to be part of all of it, not just the parts you think are safe for me." "Helena, it's not about safe. Then what's it about?" Elias struggled to find the words. "I don't want you to feel like you have to prove anything. You've already proven you belong here." "To who? The town women who think I'm scandalous? Thomas Garrett who thinks I'm your weakness?" She shook her head. "I'm not trying to prove anything to them. I'm trying to build a life that matters. And that means being involved in everything. Even the hard parts? Especially the hard parts." They rode back to the ranch the next day, just the two of them. Miguel and Carlos stayed with the herd to watch for predators and keep the cattle from wandering. The ride took most of the day. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat jerky and hardtack. "I've been thinking," Helena said, sitting on a rock overlooking a valley. "About what?" "The ranch. What we're building." She turned to look at him. "I want to start a school." Elias blinked. "A what?" "A school, for the children in the valley. There isn't one for 50 miles. Most of these kids can't read or write." "Helena, we barely have time to run the ranch." "Not now. Eventually. Maybe in a year or two." Her eyes were bright with the idea. "We could use the barn. I could teach basic reading, writing, arithmetic. Just a few hours a week during winter when there's less ranch work." "You really think people would send their kids here?" "Why wouldn't they?" "Because you're the woman who rides astride and does ranch work and refuses to act proper." Helena's smile was sharp. "Then maybe their kids will learn more than just reading and writing." Despite himself, Elias smiled too. "You're serious about this?" "Completely." She stood and brushed off her skirt. "Those children deserve a chance to be more than just ranchers if they don't want to be. Education gives them choices." "Is that what you wish you'd had? Choices?" "I had choices," Helena said. "They were just all bad until I answered your letter." She met his eyes. "I want these kids to have better choices than I did." They made it home by sunset. The cabin felt empty without Helena's presence the past few days. He'd gotten used to her being there, to the small sounds she made moving around, to her books stacked beside the bed. Over dinner, Helena brought up the school idea again, this time with more details. She'd been planning it while they rode, working out logistics in her head. "We'd need books," she said. "Basic primers, slates for writing, chalk. I could order them from Chicago." "That costs money." "We'll save for it. Or I could charge a small fee." "Nobody here has money for school fees," Helena paused. "Then we'll find another way. Maybe we could barter. Parents could pay in eggs or help with harvest or—" "Helena." Elias reached across the table and took her hand. "If you want to start a school, we'll start a school. We'll figure out the money." She looked at their joined hands, then at his face. "You mean that?" "Yeah. Even though people will think it's strange." "People already think we're strange." Helena laughed, a real full laugh that made her eyes crinkle. "That's true." That night, lying in his bedroll while Helena slept in the bed, Elias stared at the ceiling and thought about the future. About the school Helena wanted to build. About the ranch they were expanding together. About all the ways his simple life had become complicated and messy and full. He thought about telling her he loved her, but the words stuck in his throat, heavy and unfamiliar. He'd never said them to anyone, wasn't sure he knew how. Maybe she already knew, anyway. Maybe the way he'd stayed beside her during the fever, the way he supported her plans even when they seemed impossible, the way he looked at her when she wasn't paying attention. Maybe all of that said it better than words could. Or maybe he was just a coward. August arrived with thunderstorms that rolled across the valley every afternoon, violent and brief. The grass turned from gold to green again. The garden Helena had planted produced more vegetables than two people could eat. She started preserving, canning tomatoes, pickling cucumbers, making jam from wild berries she and Carlos picked in the foothills. The cabin's pantry filled with jars, neat rows of food that would carry them through winter. "You're preparing for a siege," Elias commented one evening. "I'm preparing for winter. There's a difference." Helena wiped sweat from her forehead. "Besides, we might have visitors during the cold months. People traveling through, neighbors caught in storms. Better to have too much food than not enough." "You planning on feeding the whole territory?" "If necessary." She was serious. Elias could see it in her face. Helena's vision for the ranch extended beyond just survival. She saw a community hub, a place people could rely on. It was ambitious and impractical, and exactly like her. Mid-August brought news that shook the whole valley. Sarah Patterson, the young woman who'd visited their cabin months ago, had run away 3 days before her wedding to Thomas Garrett's nephew. The whole town was in uproar. Search parties had been organized. Her father was offering a reward for information. And Thomas Garrett was telling everyone who'd listen that this was exactly the kind of chaos that happened when women got ideas above their station. Helena heard the news from Mrs. Chen, who wrote out specifically to tell her. "They're blaming you," Mrs. Chen said. "Garrett's spreading rumors that Sarah got ideas from you, that you encouraged her to abandon her duties." "I spoke to her once," Helena said. "For 5 minutes. I told her she didn't have to marry someone she didn't want to marry." "That's exactly what they're upset about." Mrs. Chen glanced at Elias, who was listening from across the room. "Mr. Garrett's saying this proves what kind of influence your wife has, that she's dangerous to decent society." Elias felt anger flare. "That's horseshit." "I agree. But it's horseshit people are believing." Mrs. Chen turned back to Helena. "Be careful. Garrett's looking for any excuse to cause you trouble." After Mrs. Chen left, Helena stood at the window staring out at the valley. "I hope she made it," she said quietly. "Who, Sarah?" "Yes. I hope she got somewhere safe, somewhere she can build a life on her own terms." Helena's hands were tight on the windowsill. She was so young, so trapped. "You think you helped her by telling her to run?" Helena turned to face him. "I helped her by telling her she had a choice. What she did with that information was up to her. And if she's in danger now, out there alone, then she's in danger because the world is cruel to women with no power, not because I told her the truth." Elias crossed the room and stood beside her. "People are going to use this against you. Let them." "Helena, what do you want me to say, Elias? That I should have kept quiet? That I should have told a terrified girl to marry a man she didn't want just to keep the peace?" She shook her head. "I won't do that. Not for Thomas Garrett. Not for anyone." He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. This woman who refused to bend even when bending would make everything easier. "I know," he said. "I wouldn't want you any other way." Something shifted in her expression. "You mean that?" "Yeah, I do." They stood at the window together, watching the sun set over the valley, and Elias felt the words pressing against his teeth again. "I love you," but he still couldn't say them. 3 days later, Sarah was found. She'd made it to Billings, 70 miles away, and gotten work at a hotel. Her father dragged her back anyway, but she refused to go through with the wedding. The scandal consumed the entire territory for weeks. And Thomas Garrett made sure everyone knew he blamed Helena Norwood for all of it. The fire started on the first day of September. Elias smelled smoke before he saw it. That acrid scent carried on the hot wind that had been blowing for 3 days straight. The kind of wind that dried everything to kindling and made ranchers nervous. He stepped out of the barn and looked east. A brown haze hung over the horizon. "Helena," he called. She came running from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's wrong?" "Smoke. East side of the valley." They both stood silent, watching the distant haze thicken. Then Helena pointed. "There. Flames." A line of orange appeared on the horizon, small at first but growing. Even from miles away they could see it spreading. "That's the Kowalski place," Elias said, his gut tightening. "They've got 2 kids, a baby. We need to warn them. They probably already know. That fire's on their land." He calculated quickly. The wind was blowing west, toward the center of the valley, toward a dozen other ranches. "We need to get word to everyone. If that fire jumps the creek, it'll burn everything in its path. Miguel and Carlos came running from the bunkhouse. Boss, you see it? Miguel asked. Yeah, Carlos, ride to the Kowalski place. See if they need help evacuating. Miguel, head to town. Ring the church bell. Get everyone mobilized. What about you? Helena asked. Elias looked at the growing wall of flame. I'm going to ride the property line. See how close it's getting. Make sure our cattle aren't in its path. I'm coming with you. Helena, don't. Her voice was steel. We're wasting time arguing. Saddle the horses. They rode hard toward the eastern fence line. The smell of smoke grew stronger with every mile. Ash started falling like gray snow. The horses danced nervously, sensing danger. When they crested the ridge overlooking the valley, Elias pulled Buck to a stop. The fire was massive, a wall of flame stretching nearly a mile wide, consuming dry grass and scattered trees with terrifying speed. The wind drove it forward like a living thing, sparks flying ahead to start new fires. And directly in its path were 3 ranches, including the Kowalski place. Sweet mercy, Helena breathed. Elias saw figures moving near the Kowalski homestead, people loading wagons, trying to save what they could. But the fire was moving too fast. They'd never get everything out in time. We need to help them, Helena said. We can't fight that fire. It's too big. Then we help them evacuate, get their livestock out, something. Elias wanted to argue that it was too dangerous, that they should focus on protecting their own ranch. But looking at Helena's face, determined and fierce, he knew that wasn't an option. Come on, he said, spurring Buck forward. They reached the Kowalski homestead 15 minutes later. The family was in chaos. Martin Kowalski and his wife, Anna, trying to load furniture while their 2 older children herded chickens into crates. The baby was crying somewhere inside the house. Martin, Elias shouted over the roar of approaching fire. Martin looked up, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Elias, thank you for coming. How much time you got? Maybe an hour if we're lucky, but the livestock, we can't get them all moved. Elias surveyed the situation. 24 cattle, a pen full of pigs, chickens everywhere, and 3 horses in the corral. Helena, he said, help Anna with the house. Get the essentials out. Miguel and I will handle the animals. Carlos arrived moments later with 2 men from a neighboring ranch. They worked frantically, driving cattle away from the advancing flames, loading pigs into a wagon, catching panicked chickens. Helena and Anna moved through the house with ruthless efficiency, grabbing clothes, documents, family photographs. The baby, a girl of maybe 8 months, cried in Anna's arms while Helena stuffed belongings into a trunk. I can't leave my mother's china, Anna said, her voice breaking. You can replace china, Helena said firmly. You can't replace your children. Keep moving. The smoke thickened. Heat rolled toward them in waves. Elias could hear the fire now, a crackling roar like 1,000 hungry mouths. Time's up, Martin shouted. Everyone out! They loaded the last wagon and started moving away from the homestead. Helena drove 1 wagon with Anna and the children. Martin drove another loaded with furniture and livestock. Elias and the other men stayed behind, driving the cattle ahead of the flames. Elias looked back once and saw the fire reach the Kowalski barn. Within minutes, it was engulfed. The house would be next. They'd gotten out just in time. By midday, half the valley was mobilizing. Church bells rang from town. Riders spread word from ranch to ranch. People gathered at the community hall to organize a defense. The fire was spreading in 2 directions now, south toward more ranches and west toward the town itself. Thomas Garrett stood at the front of the hall, taking charge like he owned the place. We need to establish fire breaks, he was saying when Elias and Helena arrived. Clear lines of grass and vegetation. Starve the fire of fuel. That won't work, Helena said, her voice cutting through the noise. Every head turned. Thomas's face darkened. Excuse me? Helena pushed forward through the crowd. Fire breaks won't work. Not with wind this strong. The fire's throwing sparks half a mile ahead. They'll just start new fires on the other side of your breaks. And what would you suggest, Mrs. Norwood? Thomas's voice dripped condescension. Perhaps we should all just pray? No. We should use irrigation trenches and controlled burns. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, one of her agricultural journals. I read about this technique used in Australia. You dig trenches and fill them with water to create wet barriers. Then you burn the grass between the trenches and the fire in a controlled way, removing the fuel before the wildfire reaches it. Thomas laughed. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're going to start fires to stop a fire? Yes, small fires we can control to stop a big fire we can't. This is exactly the problem with women getting ideas from books. Thomas addressed the room. She's read some fancy journal and thinks she knows better than men who've been fighting fires for decades. Those decades haven't stopped fires from destroying ranches every year, Helena shot back. The room erupted in argument. Some men supported Thomas, others looked uncertain. Elias saw Martin Kowalski, who'd just lost his home, studying Helena with interest. She saved my family, Martin said loudly. Got us out when everyone else was still talking. If she's got an idea, I'm willing to listen. Me too, said another rancher Elias didn't recognize. Thomas's face went red. This is insane. We don't have time for experiments based on some woman's reading. Then what's your plan, Thomas? Elias stepped forward. Because Helena's right. Your fire breaks won't work. That fire's too big and the wind's too strong. My plan is to do what's always been done. And how often does that work? Helena interrupted. How many ranches burned last year, the year before? How many families lost everything because you were too stubborn to try something different? Silence fell. Thomas looked around the room, seeing his support waver. Fine. You want to try this crazy scheme? Go ahead. But when it fails and people die, their blood is on your hands. He stormed out. Half the men followed him. The other half stayed. Martin Kowalski stepped forward. What do you need? Helena spread her journal on a table. Shovels, every able-bodied person we can get, and we need to move fast. The fire will be here in hours. They organized quickly. Helena drew a map showing where to dig trenches, using the natural topology of the land to channel water from the creek. She divided people into teams, diggers, water carriers, and fire setters who would burn the grass in controlled strips. Elias found himself taking orders from his wife, and he didn't care who saw it. You really think this will work? He asked quietly as they prepared to head out. I think it's our best chance. She looked at him, and he saw fear beneath the determination. But Elias, I need you to understand. If this fails, if people die because of my plan, I'll never forgive myself. Then we don't fail. They worked through the afternoon and into evening. Digging trenches in the hard summer ground was brutal work. Men and women swung shovels until their hands bled. Children hauled buckets of water from the creek to fill the trenches. Helena was everywhere, directing, adjusting, making quick decisions when plans didn't work. She'd stripped down to her simplest dress, her hair tied back, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She looked like she belonged there, leading this desperate effort to save the valley. The fire advanced. They could see it now from where they worked, a wall of orange and black cutting across the horizon. The heat was intense even from a mile away. Trenches are done, someone shouted. Helena climbed onto a wagon to survey the work. 4 parallel trenches, each filled with water, creating barriers across the valley. Between each trench was a strip of grass they'd need to burn in controlled fashion. Light the first strip, she ordered. Men with torches moved forward. They set fire to the grass between the first and second trenches, working quickly from north to south. The flames caught and spread, but contained between the 2 water barriers. Watch for sparks, Helena called. Don't let it jump the trenches. Teams of people stood ready with wet blankets and water buckets, stamping out any sparks that tried to spread beyond the controlled area. The first burn worked. The grass between trenches 1 and 2 was gone, creating a blackened barrier. Second strip, Helena ordered. They repeated the process. Then the third strip. The controlled burns were terrifying to watch, but Helena's plan was working. They were removing the fuel before the wildfire could reach it. By sunset, all 4 strips had been burned. The valley now had 4 water-filled trenches and 4 blackened areas where grass had been, and the wildfire was less than half a mile away. Will it hold? Anna Kowalski asked, clutching her baby. We're about to find out, Helena said. The fire hit the first trench just as darkness fell. The flames reached the water barrier and, for a terrifying moment, seemed like they might jump it. Sparks flew across. Small fires started on the far side, but teams were ready. They beat out the sparks before they could spread. The main fire, deprived of fuel in the burned strip, weakened at the trench line. It's working, someone whispered. The fire tested each trench in turn. searching for weakness, finding none. The wind that had driven it forward now worked against it, blowing flames back on already burned ground where there was nothing left to consume. By midnight, the fire had stalled at the last trench. By dawn, it had burned itself out. The valley was saved. People stood in exhausted clusters, watching the sun rise over blackened ground and smoldering ash. They'd lost the Kowalski homestead and 2 other structures on the eastern edge, but the town was safe. Most of the ranches were intact. It could have been so much worse. Helena sat on the ground near the last trench, her head in her hands. Elias walked over and sat beside her. "You did it," he said. "We did it. Everyone." She looked up and her eyes were wet. "We could have lost everything, all those families, but we didn't." He took her hand. "Because you had an idea and the courage to fight for it." "Thomas Garrett will never admit I was right. Thomas Garrett is an ass. Everyone else saw what happened." As if summoned by his name, Thomas appeared. He looked like he'd been fighting fire all night, covered in soot, his clothes torn. But his expression was hard. "You got lucky," he said to Helena. "It wasn't luck. It was planning. Could have gone wrong 100 different ways. But it didn't." Thomas took a step closer. "You think this makes you something special? That you're equal to the men here now?" Helena stood slowly, exhaustion forgotten. "I don't think I'm equal to the men here, Mr. Garrett. After last night, I think I'm better than at least one of them." For a moment, Elias thought Thomas might actually hit her. His fists clenched. His face went purple. But Martin Kowalski stepped between them. "You owe her an apology, Thomas. I owe her nothing. She saved my family, probably saved yours too." Martin's voice was hard. "If you can't admit when you're wrong, that's your problem. But don't you dare stand here and diminish what she did." Other people gathered around. Carlos, Miguel, Anna Kowalski, Mrs. Chen. Even some of the ranchers who'd followed Thomas out of the meeting. They formed a loose circle around Helena and Elias, a silent statement. Thomas looked around at the faces, saw something he didn't like, and turned away. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah, it is," Elias called after him. "You just don't know it yet." The crowd dispersed slowly. People came up to Helena one by one, thanking her, shaking her hand, calling her brave. She accepted it all with quiet grace, but Elias could see the exhaustion pulling at her. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." They rode back to the ranch in the early morning light. Everything looked different, the landscape marked by fire, the air still thick with smoke. But their land was untouched. The cabin stood exactly as they'd left it. Inside, Helena collapsed into a chair at the table. "I need to sleep for about a week," she said. "You earned it." But instead of going to bed, she just sat there, staring at nothing. "Helena?" "I was terrified," she said quietly. "The whole time. Every decision I made, I was thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if this kills someone?" Elias knelt beside her chair. "But you did it anyway. Because someone had to." "No. Because you're brave enough to try even when you're scared." He took her hands. "That's what courage is, Helena. Not the absence of fear, just refusing to let fear win." She looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "Elias, I love you." The words came out before he could stop them, raw and unpolished and completely honest. Helena's eyes widened. "What?" "I love you. I've loved you since Christmas, maybe before. I don't know when it happened, but watching you last night, leading everyone, fighting for this valley..." He had to stop and swallow hard. "You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I love you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting clean paths through the soot. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to, telling myself this was just practical, just survival. But Elias, I love you so much it terrifies me." He pulled her down from the chair and kissed her. She tasted like smoke and salt and everything he'd ever wanted without knowing it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Helena laughed. "We smell terrible," she said. "Yeah. And we're covered in ash, yeah. And I'm so tired I can barely stand." "Me too." She kissed him again, softer this time. "Take me to bed." "Helena, I don't mean sleep." "Well, eventually sleep. But first..." She stood and took his hand. We've been married almost a year. I think it's time we actually acted like it. Elias felt heat that had nothing to do with the fire spread through his chest. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other in the gray morning light. Helena was fierce and vulnerable all at once, and Elias tried to show her with his hands and mouth everything he couldn't say with words. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, exhausted and complete. We need a bigger bed, Helena said drowsily. Add it to the list. What list? The list of things we're building. Elias pulled her closer. Better barn, schoolhouse, bigger bed, a life. Helena smiled against his chest. I like that list. They slept through the day and into the night, wrapped around each other like they were afraid to let go. The next few weeks were strange. The fire had changed something in the valley's social dynamics. Helena was no longer the scandalous mail-order bride who refused to know her place. She was the woman who'd saved dozens of families. People who'd whispered about her before now greeted her on the street. Women who'd judged her asked for her advice. Even Reverend Walsh stopped by the ranch to thank her personally. You did a remarkable thing, he said. I read a lot, Helena replied. That's all. You did more than read. You acted. That takes wisdom. After he left, Helena turned to Elias. That was strange. You're a hero now. Better get used to it. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to live my life. Too late. But with the new respect came new responsibilities. Families started showing up at the ranch asking for help with various problems. Sick livestock, broken equipment, disputes over property lines. Helena handled it all with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. She helped a widow repair her well, showed a struggling farmer better irrigation techniques, even mediated an argument between two ranchers over grazing rights. You're becoming the valley's unofficial problem solver, Elias observed one evening. Someone has to do it. You could say no. Helena looked at him. Could I? These people need help. I have knowledge that might help them. How do I say no to that? You can't, Elias smiled, which is exactly my point. October brought the first snow in time to bring the cattle down from the high pasture. Helena rode with them again. Her, Elias, Miguel, and Carlos, plus 2 additional hands they'd hired for the drive. She sat easier in the saddle now, comfortable with the horse and the work. The drive went smoothly until the second day when they found 2 men waiting at a narrow canyon pass. Thomas Garrett and his foreman. Elias reined in Buck, his hand moving automatically to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Thomas, what do you want? Just making sure you're not driving cattle across my land. We're on the territorial trail, same as every year. Trail's on my land. I've got a deed that proves it. Elias felt anger spike. That trail's been public access for 20 years. Was. Things change. Thomas smiled. You want to use it, there's a toll, $5 a head. That's $1,500. Good at math, aren't you? Must be that educated wife teaching you. Helena urged Rosie forward. Mr. Garrett, you know that trail is public land. I know what my deed says, and I know I'm within my rights to charge for access. Thomas's smile widened. Of course, if it's too expensive, you could always drive your cattle the long way, through the marsh, though you'll probably lose 1/3 of them to the mud. Elias calculated quickly. The marsh route would take 3 extra days and risk losing animals, but $1,500 would wipe out their entire year's profit. This is extortion, Helena said. This is business, Mrs. Norwood. Something you might understand if you spent less time playing rancher and more time learning your place. My place, Helena said slowly, is wherever I choose it to be. And right now, it's sitting on this horse, on this public trail, with my cattle behind me. Then you'll pay the toll. Show me the deed. Thomas pulled a rolled paper from his saddlebag. Helena took it and read carefully, her brow furrowed. This deed describes property boundaries, she said, but it doesn't mention the trail specifically, and territorial law states that established public trails maintain their status even when land changes hands. Where'd you read that? Another one of your fancy journals? No. The Territorial Land Office. When you filed that false complaint against us last spring, I spent several days reading every law related to land rights, water access, and public trails. She handed back the deed. You have no legal right to charge a toll, And if you continue to block this trail, I'll file a complaint with the marshal in Billings. Thomas's smile vanished. You threatening me? I'm informing you of the law. For a long moment, nobody moved. The cattle shifted restlessly behind them. Elias's hand stayed near his rifle. Finally, Thomas yanked his horse around. This isn't over, Norwood. You or your bitch wife. Call her that again, Elias said quietly, and you'll be eating your teeth. Thomas rode off without responding. His foreman followed. After they were gone, Carlos let out a low whistle. That was tense. He's not going to stop, Miguel said. He'll keep pushing. Let him push, Helena said. I'm done being afraid of Thomas Garrett. They drove the cattle home without further incident. But Elias knew Miguel was right. Thomas wasn't going to stop. He'd been publicly embarrassed too many times. Men like that didn't forgive. They got revenge. The question wasn't if Thomas would make another move. It was when, and what it would cost them to stop him. November arrived with cold winds and the first hard freeze. The ranch settled into winter routines. But this year felt different. The cabin was warmer, the work less lonely. Helena's presence had transformed everything. They spent evenings planning the school she wanted to start in spring, ordering books from Chicago, figuring out how to convert part of the barn into a classroom. We'll need desks, Helena said, making notes. I can build those. And a blackboard. Can probably get one in Bozeman. She looked up from her list. You're really okay with this? It's going to be a lot of work. Helena, I'm okay with anything that makes you happy. Elias reached across the table for her hand. Besides, those kids need education. You're right about that. What changed? Back in July, you thought this was impossible. Back in July, I watched my wife save an entire valley from burning. After that, starting a school seems pretty manageable. Helena laughed. Fair point. They made love that night in their new, bigger bed, one of the first things Elias had built after the fire. Helena was less hesitant now, more confident. She knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to ask for it. Afterward, lying in the dark, she said, I'm happy here. I didn't think I would be, but I am. Good. I know I'm difficult. I argue too much. I challenge everything. Helena. Elias turned to face her. I don't want you to be different. I want you exactly as you are. Difficult and stubborn and brilliant. She kissed him softly. I want to have children. Eventually. Yeah? Not yet. Maybe in a year or two. Once the school is running. Once we're more stable. She paused. Is that okay? It's more than okay. He pulled her closer. Whatever you want. Whenever you're ready. I love you, she whispered. I love you too. Outside, snow started falling. The first real snow of winter. Inside the cabin, warm and safe, Elias Norwood held his impossible, stubborn wife and thought about the future they were building. It wouldn't be easy. Thomas Garrett wasn't done causing trouble. The territory was harsh and unforgiving. Winter would test them again. But they'd survived worse. Together, they could survive anything. The wedding happened on a Friday in late November, exactly 1 year after Helena had stepped off that train. Not their legal wedding, that had been the rushed ceremony with Reverend Walsh back when they were strangers bound by a letter in desperation. This was something different, something they chose. Helena's idea, naturally. We got married because we had to, she'd said one evening in early November. I want to marry you because I want to. So they planned a small ceremony in the cabin, just the two of them and a handful of people who actually mattered. Miguel and Carlos, Anna and Martin Kowalski with their children, Mrs. Chen, even Sarah Patterson, who'd returned to the valley after her father finally accepted she wouldn't marry Thomas Garrett's nephew. Reverend Walsh agreed to perform the ceremony again, though he looked confused about the whole arrangement. You're already married, he pointed out. Consider it a renewal of vows, Helena said. After 1 year? We had a difficult first year. That was putting it mildly. Helena wore the green dress from Christmas, the one Elias had only seen her wear once before. She'd let her hair down, and in the candlelight of the cabin, she looked nothing like the severe woman who'd criticized his photograph a year ago. She looked happy. Elias wore his best shirt, the one Helena had sewn for him, with buttons that actually matched and sleeves that fit properly. His hands shook slightly as he stood beside her. You nervous? she whispered. Yeah. Good. Me too. Reverend Walsh read from his prayer book, the same words as before. But this time, when Elias said, I do, he meant something entirely different. Not obligation or practicality, but choice, love, a future he actually wanted. Helena's eyes were wet when she said her vows, her voice steady despite the tears. When the Reverend pronounced them married, again, Elias kissed his wife like he'd wanted to that first time but hadn't known how. The small gathering cheered. Anna Kowalski cried. Miguel and Carlos whistled and clapped. And for one perfect moment in that rough cabin in the Montana wilderness, everything felt exactly right. They celebrated with a dinner Helena had spent 2 days preparing. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar, and a cake Anna had made. The cabin was crowded with people, warm with conversation and laughter. Martin Kowalski raised his glass. To Helena and Elias, the stubbornest couple in Montana. Hear, hear, Carlos called. And to Helena, Anna added, who saved our lives and taught us that reading fancy journals might actually be useful. Everyone laughed. Helena blushed but smiled. Later, after the guests had left and they were cleaning up, Elias found her standing at the window looking out at the snow-covered valley. Happy? He asked. Very. She turned to face him. This year has been the hardest of my life. And the best. Yeah. He pulled her close. Same. They stood together in the quiet cabin, and Elias thought about how far they'd come. From two desperate people trying to survive to something neither of them had expected. A partnership. A marriage. A home. December brought heavy snow and the kind of cold that made your lungs ache. But inside the cabin, with the stove burning and Helena beside him, Elias had never felt warmer. They spent the long winter evenings working on the school project. Elias built small desks from rough lumber while Helena organized the books that had arrived from Chicago. Primers, arithmetic texts, simple literature, the beginning of a real education. First class starts in March, she announced one night. How many students you expecting? I've had 7 families express interest, 12 children total, ages 6 to 14. That's a lot. That's a beginning. She held up one of the primers. These kids deserve a chance, Elias, a chance to be more than what their parents were, to choose their own paths. Like you did. Like I tried to. She set down the book. I was lucky. I had parents who taught me to read, even though it was unusual for girls. Then I had the factory, which was horrible, but it taught me I could survive anything. And then I had your letter. Best letter I ever wrote. Helena laughed. It was the worst letter I've ever read. Seeking practical woman. You made it sound like you were buying a plow. I was terrible at romance. You still are. But she was smiling. Good thing I don't need romance. I need partnership, and you're excellent at that. We're excellent at it. Yes, she agreed. We are. The real test of that partnership came in mid-January. Elias and Miguel were in town buying supplies when they ran into Thomas Garrett outside the land office. Thomas looked smug, which was never a good sign. Elias, he said, glad I ran into you. What do you want, Thomas? Just thought you should know. I'm buying the Morrison place. They're selling out, heading to California. The Morrison Ranch bordered Elias's land to the north. If Thomas bought it, he'd control 3 sides of the Norwood property. Good luck to you, Elias said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Oh, it's already done. Papers signed yesterday. Thomas's smile widened. Which means that creek running through both our properties, the one that feeds your cattle? Well, I've been thinking about damming it upstream. For my own irrigation purposes, you understand. Elias felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. That creek's been shared water for 20 years. Was shared water. Now it runs through my land first, and territorial law says I can use it however I see fit. You can't just cut off my water. Watch me. Thomas tipped his hat. Have a nice day, Elias. Give my regards to that clever wife of yours. Miguel waited until Thomas was out of earshot. Boss, he can't actually do that, can he? I don't know, Elias said, but we need to find out. They went straight to the territorial land office. The clerk, Peterson, pulled the relevant documents and confirmed Elias's worst fears. If Mr. Garrett owns the land where the creek originates, he has primary water rights. He can dam or divert it as he sees fit, as long as he's not violating any prior agreements. There's got to be prior agreements, Elias said. That water's been shared for decades. Peterson searched through old files. Finally, he shook his head. No written agreements on record. I'm sorry, Mr. Norwood. Without documentation, there's nothing preventing Mr. Garrett from damming that creek. Elias rode home in silence, his mind racing. Without water, his cattle would die. The ranch would be worthless. Everything they'd built would collapse. Helena took the news better than he expected. We'll fight it, she said simply. How? Peterson said there's no legal standing. Then we create legal standing. She pulled out paper and started writing. We'll file for established water rights based on historical usage. Gather testimony from every rancher who's used that creek. Document decades of shared access. That could take months. Thomas could dam the creek tomorrow. Then we also file an injunction. Request that no changes be made to the creek until the case is settled. Elias stared at her. Where are you learning this? I've been reading territorial law since Thomas first started causing trouble. I knew he'd try something eventually. She kept writing. We'll need witnesses. Everyone who's relied on that creek, and we'll need to prove that damming it would cause undue hardship to established ranches. You really think this will work? Helena stopped writing and looked at him. I think if we don't try, we've already lost. So yes, we try. And we fight. Because that's what we do. They spent the next 2 weeks gathering evidence, writing to every ranch in the valley, collecting written statements about the creek's historical usage. Helena documented everything in her precise handwriting, creating a legal argument that would have impressed a trained lawyer. Martin Kowalski signed immediately. After what you did during the fire, I'd testify against the devil himself if you asked. Mrs. Chen provided testimony about how her late husband had used the creek for 30 years. Even some of Thomas's allies quietly admitted the creek had always been shared water. By early February, Helena had compiled a case file 3 inches thick. They filed it with the territorial office and requested an emergency injunction preventing any changes to the creek until a judge could review the evidence. Thomas Garrett was furious. He showed up at the ranch 2 days later with 4 of his men. Elias saw them coming and called for Helena to stay inside. She ignored him and came out anyway, standing beside him in the yard. You just can't help yourself, can you? Thomas said, still mounted. Always got to fight. Always got to challenge. We're protecting our rights, Helena said. Same as you claim to be doing. Your rights? Thomas laughed harshly. You're a woman. You don't have rights. You have whatever your husband allows you. That's not how our marriage works. Yeah, I've noticed. You've got him trained like a dog. Say jump. He asks how high. Elias stepped forward. Get off my property, Thomas. Or what? You'll sick your wife on me? Thomas leaned forward in his saddle. You're not a man, Elias. You're a joke. The whole valley knows it. Letting your woman wear the pants, make the decisions. My wife, Elias said quietly, is smarter than you'll ever be. Braver too. And if that makes me a joke, I'll wear it with pride. You're pathetic. Maybe. But we filed a legal injunction against you, and it's been approved. You dam that creek, you'll be in violation of territorial law. Elias smiled. So who's pathetic now? Thomas's face went dark red. For a moment, Elias thought he might actually draw a weapon. His hand moved toward his belt. Helena stepped forward. Mr. Garrett, you have 2 choices. You can accept the legal process and wait for a judge to rule. Or you can try violence and spend the rest of your life in a territorial prison. Choose carefully. The 4 men with Thomas shifted uneasily. They'd signed on for ranch work, not murder. Finally, Thomas yanked his horse around. This isn't over. Yeah, Thomas, Elias called after him. It is. You just don't want to admit you lost. After they were gone, Helena let out a shaky breath. That was terrifying. You didn't show it. I was screaming inside. She turned to him. Elias, what if he doesn't stop? What if he tries something violent? Then we deal with it. Elias pulled her close. But I think Thomas is smart enough to know he can't win that way. The whole valley saw what you did during the fire. People respect you now. If something happened to us, they'd know exactly who to blame. I hope you're right. So do I. The territorial judge arrived in March to hear the water rights case. The hearing took place in the community hall, packed with ranchers and townspeople who'd come to watch. Thomas Garrett sat at one table with a lawyer he'd brought from Helena. Elias and Helena sat at another table alone. The judge, a tired-looking man named Crawford, reviewed the evidence. Helena presented their case. She spoke clearly and confidently, citing territorial law, presenting testimony, explaining the historical usage of the creek. She'd memorized every detail of their argument. Thomas's lawyer tried to interrupt several times. The judge silenced him. When Helena finished, she sat down beside Elias. Her hands were shaking, but her face was calm. Thomas's lawyer presented his case, that property ownership gave Mr. Garrett absolute rights to water on his land, that historical usage meant nothing without written agreements. The judge listened, made notes, and finally held up his hand for silence. "This is a complex case," he said. "Property rights versus established usage. Written law versus common practice. I'll need time to consider my ruling." "How much time?" Thomas demanded. "As much as I need." Judge Crawford closed his folder. "In the meantime, the injunction stands, no changes to the creek until I've made my decision. Hearing adjourned." The waiting was torture. Days turned into weeks. March became April. The snow melted, revealing brown grass and the first hints of green. Calving season began again, demanding long hours and constant attention. Helena threw herself into preparing for the school. The barn conversion was almost complete. Desks arranged in rows, a blackboard mounted on the wall, books stacked on shelves Elias had built. "First day is next Monday," she said one evening. 12 students enrolled. "You nervous?" "Terrified." She laughed. "What if I'm terrible at teaching? What if the children hate me?" "They won't hate you." "How do you know?" "Because you're you. You don't do anything halfway." Elias pulled her onto his lap. "You're going to be amazing." "I hope so." She rested her head against his shoulder. "This matters, Elias. These children, they're the future of this valley. If I can give them tools to build better lives, to think critically, to question when things are wrong, then you'll have done something that matters more than any of us ranching." She kissed him softly. "I love you." "Love you too." The school opened on a rainy Monday in April. 12 children filed into the converted barn, ranging from 6-year-old Emma Kowalski to 14-year-old James Chen. They looked nervous and excited and curious. Helena stood at the front of the makeshift classroom, her heart pounding. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Norwood, but you can call me Miss Helena. Welcome to our school." For the next 3 hours, she taught. Basic alphabet for the younger children, reading comprehension for the older ones, simple arithmetic across the board. It was chaotic. Emma wouldn't stop fidgeting. James clearly thought he was too old for school. 2 of the middle children got into a shoving match during a break, but when the day ended and the children filed out, they were smiling. "See you tomorrow, Miss Helena," Emma called. "Tomorrow," Helena agreed. After they were gone, she collapsed into the chair behind her desk. Elias, who'd been watching from the barn doorway, walked over. "How'd it go?" "I have no idea." Helena laughed shakily. "It was chaos, but good chaos, I think." The kids looked happy. "They did, didn't they?" She stood and looked around at the classroom. "This is just the beginning. Once we get established, maybe we can expand, teach more advanced subjects, bring in other teachers. One step at a time," Elias said gently. "I know. But Elias, this could really be something, a real school. Not just basic literacy, but actual education. Then we'll make it something." She kissed him. "Thank you for believing in this, for building all these desks, for supporting something that doesn't directly benefit the ranch. It benefits us. Everything that makes you happy benefits us." The letter from Judge Crawford arrived in late April. Elias brought it back from town, the official envelope heavy in his hands. He and Helena sat at the kitchen table staring at it. "Open it," Helena said. "What if we lost?" "Then we lost, but we still need to know." Elias broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the formal language, the legal phrasing, searching for the relevant passage. There. "We won," he said quietly. "What?" "We won. Crawford ruled in our favor. Says historical usage establishes shared water rights regardless of property ownership. Thomas has to maintain current flow levels. He can't dam or divert the creek." Helena grabbed the letter and read it herself, her eyes moving quickly across the page. Then she started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound. "We actually won! Against Thomas Garrett and his lawyer. We won!" Elias pulled her into his arms. "You won. That case was all you." "It was us." "No, it was you." He held her tight. "You saved the ranch, Helena. Again." They celebrated quietly that night. No big gathering, just the two of them with a special dinner and a bottle of whiskey Elias had been saving. "To victory," Helena said, raising her glass. "To you," Elias corrected. They drank, and Helena felt something settle inside her. The constant fight, the endless struggle. Maybe it was finally over. Maybe they could just live now, build, create, exist without constantly defending their right to exist. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked. "That I'm tired of fighting." "Yeah, me too." "But I'd do it again if I had to, for this." She gestured around the cabin. "For us." "I know you would. That's what makes you terrifying." Helena smiled. "Good. A little fear keeps things interesting." Thomas Garrett left Montana Territory in June. Nobody knew the full story, but rumors spread quickly. His ranch was heavily mortgaged. The legal fees from fighting the water case had drained his resources. And after Judge Crawford's ruling, other ranchers Thomas had bullied started filing their own complaints. He sold out to a consortium of smaller ranchers and disappeared, supposedly heading to California. The valley breathed easier after he was gone. "Good riddance," Miguel said when they heard the news. "I almost feel sorry for him," Helena said. Elias looked at her in surprise. After everything he did? He spent so much energy trying to control everyone around him, fighting battles that didn't matter. And in the end, what did it get him? Nothing. She shook her head. "That's not a life. That's just existence fueled by anger. You're more generous than I am. I just recognize that we won because we built something worth fighting for." Thomas never had that. He only had what he could take from others. Summer brought growth and prosperity. The cattle thrived. Helena's garden produced more vegetables than ever. The school grew to 15 students, with 2 more families requesting enrollment for the fall term. In July, Helena came to Elias with news that made his heart stop. "I'm pregnant." He stared at her. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor, but yes, all the signs are there." Elias pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions he couldn't name. Fear and joy and anticipation, all tangled together. "Are you happy?" Helena asked against his chest. "I'm terrified." "Me too. But yeah, I'm happy." She pulled back to look at him. "I want to keep teaching, at least for the next few months while I can." "Okay, and I'll need help after the baby comes. We might need to hire someone." "Helena." Elias cupped her face in his hands. "We'll figure it out, just like we figured out everything else." "Together?" "Always together." The baby was born in early March during a late winter storm that turned the world white and quiet. Mrs. Chen and Anna Kowalski helped with the delivery while Elias paced outside the cabin, listening to Helena's labored breathing and occasional cries through the door. It took hours, long, terrifying hours where Elias imagined every possible disaster. Then he heard it, a baby's cry. The door opened. Anna stood there, smiling and exhausted. "You have a daughter." Elias stumbled into the cabin. Helena lay in bed, pale and sweaty, and holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when he entered, and her smile was brilliant. "Come meet your daughter." He approached carefully, like the baby might break if he breathed wrong. Helena pulled back the blanket, revealing a small red face, dark hair, and eyes that were trying to focus on the world. "She's perfect," Elias whispered. "She's loud," Helena corrected, "and demanding, already takes after me." "What should we name her?" Helena had been thinking about this. "Sarah, after the girl who was brave enough to run." "Sarah Norwood." "Do you like it?" Elias touched his daughter's tiny hand, felt her fingers curl around his. "It's perfect." The school reopened in April, with Helena teaching while Anna Kowalski watched baby Sarah. It was chaotic and exhausting, but Helena refused to give up either role. I can be a mother and a teacher, she insisted when Elias suggested she take more time off. I know you can. I'm just saying you don't have to. But I want to. She was nursing Sarah while reviewing lesson plans. These children need education, and Sarah needs to grow up seeing her mother do meaningful work. Both things matter. Elias couldn't argue with that. By summer, they'd settled into a new routine. Sarah was growing fast, a happy baby who seemed content to be passed between parents and ranch hands as needed. The school was thriving. The ranch was profitable for the first time in years. They'd built something real. One evening in August, sitting on the porch while Sarah slept in her cradle, Helena said, "Do you ever think about that first day, when I got off the train?" "All the time." "What do you think about?" Elias considered. "How sure I was that I'd made a mistake. How you looked at me like I was something disappointing you'd ordered and couldn't return." Helena laughed. "You were disappointing, shorter than your photograph suggested." "You've never let me forget that?" "And I never will." She leaned against his shoulder. "I was terrified, trying so hard to be brave. But inside I was sure I'd made a horrible mistake." "When did you stop thinking that?" "Christmas, the first one. When you stayed up reading to me during the fever, or maybe before that. I don't know, it happened gradually. One day I looked around and realized this felt like home." "Yeah." Elias put his arm around her. "Same." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their valley, their land, their home. "Elias?" "I'm glad I answered your terrible letter." "Me too." 5 years later, the Norwood Ranch was the heart of Yellowstone Valley. The school had expanded to a proper building with 2 teachers, Helena and a young woman named Catherine, who'd come west specifically to teach. 23 students attended regularly, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but science, history, and critical thinking. The ranch itself had grown too. 400 head of cattle, a new barn, a larger house. Still simple, but with actual rooms instead of just one space. 2 more children, a son named Eric and another daughter named Anna after their friend. But more than the physical growth, it was the community that had transformed. The Norwood place became where people came when they needed help. Helena mediated disputes, advised on business decisions, and helped families navigate the increasingly complex territorial bureaucracy. Elias ran one of the most respected cattle operations in Montana, known for fair dealing and innovative practices. Together, they'd created something neither had imagined that cold November day when Helena stepped off the train. One afternoon in late summer, sitting on their expanded porch while the children played in the yard, Helena said, "We did it." "Did what?" "Built a life that matters, made something worth fighting for." Elias watched his children, Sarah, now 5, teaching her younger siblings to stack rocks. Strong and confident, just like her mother. "Yeah," he said, "we did." "Do you ever regret it, that letter, all of this?" He turned to look at his wife. Older now, with lines around her eyes and gray threading through her blonde hair. Still stubborn, still sharp. Still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Not for a second," Helena smiled. "Good answer." It's the truth. Years later, when travelers passed through Yellowstone Valley, they still told stories about the stubborn Norwegian rancher and the German woman who'd transformed a wilderness into a community, about the school that educated generations of children, about the ranch that became a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept limitations. But the real story was simpler than all that. It was about 2 broken people who found each other in the hardest place imaginable, who built something from nothing, not because it was easy, but because they were too stubborn to quit, who learned that strength isn't about doing things alone. It's about finding someone who'll stand beside you when everything falls apart. Elias and Helena never became perfect. They still argued. They still struggled through brutal winters and economic hardships and all the 1,000 small disasters that make up a life. But they faced it together. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The cabin Elias had built for one eventually housed 4, then 6, then became a gathering place for an entire community. The lonely man who'd ordered a wife like farm equipment learned that partnership was stronger than pride. The desperate woman who'd answered that letter discovered that choosing your own path didn't mean walking it alone. They taught their children that education was freedom, that stubbornness could be strength, that the world would always try to tell you what you should be, but you got to decide what you actually became. Sarah grew up to be a teacher like her mother, opening schools across Montana territory. Eric became a rancher, but also a territorial legislator, fighting for laws that protected small farmers. Little Anna became a doctor, one of the first women to practice medicine in the state. All of them carried forward the lessons their parents had lived. That you fight for what matters. That you don't let anyone tell you who you're supposed to be. That love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up even when things are hard, especially when things are hard. The Norwood Ranch stood for another 50 years, through statehood and changing times and all the transformations that come with progress. Long after Elias and Helena were gone, their legacy remained. Not in monuments or grand gestures, but in the lives they'd touched, the children they'd educated, the community they'd built from nothing but determination and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. In the end, that was the real story. Two people who should have been wrong for each other somehow became exactly right. Who took a practical arrangement and transformed it into something that mattered. Who proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the risks you're most afraid to take. Elias Norwood got his practical wife. Helena Norwood got her freedom. And together, they built something neither of them could have built alone. A home, a family, a legacy, a life worth living. And really, what more could anyone ask for?